back to Books and Ideas. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and if you're a long-time listener, I want to thank you for your patience. My goal is to put out an episode every month in 2019, and today's guest is Rhodes Perry. Before I tell you a little bit more about Rhodes, I want to remind you that complete show notes are available at booksandideas.com, and you can send me feedback at docartemis@gmail.com. One of my favorite things to do on Books and Ideas is to interview fellow podcasters, especially those who have written books. Rhodes Perry is the host of one of my favorite podcasts, The Out Entrepreneur, and I invited him on Books and Ideas today to tell us about his first book, which is called Belonging at Work, Everyday Actions You Can Take to Cultivate an Inclusive Organization. The core audience for this book is people working in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But in our conversation, we focus on why it's important to feel like we belong, especially at work. This is a universal need, and Rhodes shares of some very practical approaches that can be applied in a wide variety of situations. I'll be back after the interview to highlight a few key ideas. Rhodes, I'm really looking forward to talking to you about your new book, Belonging at Work, Everyday Actions You Can Take to Cultivate an Inclusive Organization.
Thank you so much for having me on the show, Ginger. I'm really excited to be here as well.
Will you start out by just telling us a little bit about Rhodes Perry?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a big question. So I guess in sum, the book itself is 39 years in the making. So it's really kind of chronicles my experiences over my lifetime of knowing when I belong and when I don't. And I think for the purpose of this interview, what's probably most interesting about me is I've spent the past 20 years serving as a LGBT advocate in a variety of settings, in both advocacy organizations as well as working for large federal agencies like the White House. I've worked for local agencies in New York City. And that experience really shaped writing this book and kind of stitching in the lessons learned that I've had in those positions to share with leaders, to share with visionaries, movers and shakers, to really help them think about how they can cultivate a culture of belonging. And so that's what I do in my business that I have now. So I made that switch of jumping for working for someone else as an employee in those different sectors. And I decided to start my own business because I realized that more businesses, more nonprofit organizations, more government agencies really needed support around moving beyond just, we welcome everyone. This is our diversity, equity, and inclusion statement, to really understanding how to stitch that statement into the strategic goals of an organization, and most importantly, the everyday practices. And so kind of moving beyond just leaders taking that role and making sure that, if you're an employee, if you work on the front lines of an organization with 16,000 people, you still play a role in doing this work. And that's kind of how my very abridged background has inspired me to write this book.
So The Out Entrepreneur, your podcast, which is how I discovered your work, was that something that you knew you were going to do or came about because you were doing this kind of work?
It was a both and. The primary driver for me to start that podcast was recognizing that I started it after 1 year in business, and I realized I need mentors, and I want to connect with business owners that are 10, 20, 30 years down the road, for the most part, who figured it out. They figured out not only how to create a successful business that is in alignment with their values and their beliefs and their purpose, but also they figured out how to really show up 100% authentically in the work that they do, by choosing clients if organizations or really targeting a particular customer if they sell a product or a good of some sort, and really pick their brains of understanding that journey, not because, selfishly it benefited me. I could have just picked up the phone and called the people that I've interviewed. What I wanted to do was to also share it with other entrepreneurs broadly, people that are early on in their pursuits of building a business, to share some of those strategies that could save you, years sometimes in building a business, and also to feature and lift up LGBT people. So for a general audience, the acronym lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. It's kind of an alphabet soup, but really featuring people with a sexual orientation that's not straight and a gender identity that is not someone who's cisgender, to show that LGBT people are contributing to the economy, that we're really innovative and we're creating jobs and, we're living our lives. To share a richer narrative than what you might just read in a newspaper about LGBT communities trying to fight for rights, which is something that's also really important to me based on my career. So that was the genesis of the show. And it's really turned into something pretty incredible. I mean, it complements my business, although my business definitely focuses more holistically on welcoming historically underrepresented and undervalued people in the workplace. So LGBT people, of course, are included in that. But it's much bigger. It's been really interesting to see how these kind of separate projects, I guess, are kind of crossing paths now in a really profound way. And I love it. I know that you're a longtime podcaster and the medium is so engaging. And I love these kind of conversations where we can talk more beyond just sound bites that sometimes you just get, if you're featured in a newspaper article or on a TV show. So it's been fun.
So I'm going to have to ask you to define a term that you take for granted that my books and ideas audience may not be familiar with, and that's the term cisgender.
Oh, yes. Okay. So for your audience, I am a transgender man. So I was assigned female at birth. So when I was born, a doctor wrote on my birth certificate, all right, this is a baby girl. And as I grew up, in my early 20s, I found words to describe, how I felt about my gender. Looking back on my life, I always felt that I was a boy and I transitioned my gender. So that is what makes me a transgender man. For most people, for about 99% of the world's population, the sex that you're assigned at birth aligns with how you identify your gender. So basically, it's Latin. So trans means across. So I transitioned across genders, and for most people, they are on the same side, and that's what cis means in Latin. It's a new term. So I think for a lot of your audience, you now have another way to describe who you are in the world.
And what motivated you to write this book, Belonging at Work?
That's a great question. And I, in the preface of the book, write about an experience that I had right after grad school. I was really excited. I got a job working for the White House Office of OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. This was one of the motivators for me to write the book. This was several presidential administrations ago, and it was before there were protections for gender identity as well as sexual orientation. So I had already transitioned. And so people saw me exactly how I live in the world. They use the right pronouns, he and him and his, and they address me by my name. They just saw me like any other guy in the office, which is great. That's exactly how I want to live in the world. But it got to a point where I didn't feel that my job was secure and that I couldn't be myself. I couldn't be authentic 100% of the time. And in that preface, I talk about some of the things that we take for granted. So when you go on site visits or you're traveling with your colleagues and you inevitably start talking about your life in high school or when you were a little kid. And I would always have to censor those stories because I didn't feel that if I shared information about my gender history, meaning that, sharing stories about when I was younger, being raised as a young girl and a young woman, that I could share that without it being used against me, retaliation, or more importantly, being underestimated and not getting those stretch assignments and not being able to advance in that organization. So I covered. In my book, I talk about this concept of covering, which about 75% of us do. So even the most enfranchised people, I mean, you think about, white, cisgender, straight guys on Wall Street, they're also covering in different ways. And basically what that means is that you're allowing people to see who you are so long as it gives you advantages, but you're not showing your full self. You're not comfortable. You realize that if you share things that make you vulnerable, that could go against you in the workplace. And unfortunately, that's an old model of leadership where we believe, that we have to assimilate. We have to almost be like automatons, in order to be accepted, to fit in, and to be seen as the right quote unquote fit. And the great thing, and I talk about this in the book, is that for younger generations, so we're thinking millennials, or some people call Generation Z or iGen, these generations really do not want to work in a workplace that doesn't value allowing them to show up authentically. And it really is shifting the way that leadership, the way that senior leaders are thinking about what is professional in the workplace and what can we show up authentically? And if so, how do we do it? And I talk a lot about the how in the latter part of the book, which is really where people want to start. And I would caution just immediately jumping into, okay, we have to fix this, to doing that personal work, really understanding what it is we're talking about, and really getting clear on why this matters, because there will be resistors when you're trying to create a workplace environment that does value underrepresented talent and talent like myself. So I am a transgender person, and all I want to do, in those environments is show up, allow my contributions to be valued. Hopefully they're valued by the team, and allow, have the platform, have the runway to really show off my genius, in the areas that I was hired to do a specific job. And I think that's what most of us want, and it gets to the human need for belonging. So if you look at the Maslow's pyramid of needs, after physical safety, you kind of move up the pyramid and you get to loving and belonging. And that is essential for all of us. And unfortunately, too many of us don't feel that in the workplace. And so I'm trying to start a movement to shift that. And it's been great, getting the book out there and getting the message out there. People are really responding in a positive way. And that was my hope. At least it's helped a few people, if not more. And it feels really good.
Can you expand on this idea of the importance of belonging?
Absolutely. And I would start with the inverse of belonging, which is in situations where we don't belong, there's a lot of psychological harm that comes from that. This is probably more in your field than mine, but there's a lot of brain science around the feeling, the emotional feeling of not belonging, of feeling rejected, of not fitting in, that triggers it lights up the same part of your brain as if you were experiencing physical pain. And if you endure this for even, say, you feel like you don't fit in at work, right? I mean, every day you're spending, the best waking hours of your day in an environment where that part of your brain, at some point, maybe it's not consistent, but it's getting triggered. The act of not belonging is triggering the part of the brain that feels like physical pain. And really what that does is, if you think of your brain like an operating system, right? Like your computer, there's a percentage of your brain that is trying to negotiate and cope with this feeling that is not being fully utilized. Your brain is not fully focused on, why you're sitting at a desk or whatever the function is of your job. You're not fully there. And what this really translates to for organizations, and this is the piece that usually compels a lot of leaders to kind of pay attention to why this matters, is that workers that don't feel that they don't belong feel that they don't have purpose. And there's a couple of studies, and I feature them in my book, that present that 72% of workers in the United States feel that they have no purpose. When they show up to work, their work is purposeless. And that's a huge, huge loss, in terms of an organization, at a more micro level. If you're just concerned about GDP or kind of these economic indicators of success, there's a lot of loss, right? On top of, if you're someone who's more heart-centered, what does this do to an individual worker? How does that impact their everyday life? How does it impact their family life? How does it impact communities? So work plays a really important role in most of our lives. So kind of looking at the belonging piece, the inverse of the reality that we see every day in our workplace, that's really what I wanted to explore in the book. So I tried to divide the book up in a way that people could really understand how this fits into some of the efforts that are being done in the workplace, especially when you look at initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So trying to create a workplace that values talent that looks different than kind of the dominant workplace culture. So, we'll use the financial industry as an example, which is dominated mostly by white, straight, cisgender men. So in that example, in a diversity, equity, and inclusion program, that industry in particular is trying to hire more people of color, more women, perhaps more LGBT people, people with different abilities, veterans. I mean, you kind of go down the list of people that aren't represented in these kind of different workplace sectors. And it varies, depending on the sector that we're talking about. And, for the most part, organizations do a pretty good job of saying, all right, we're going to come up with a statement. We're going to try to change some things around with recruiting. But the piece that I think is missing is there are exceptions, but for the most part, and this is the work that I do every day, I don't see a lot of intentions being set around, we know that we are moving the needle when we see these benchmarks met. And our end goal looks like this. A workplace of belonging, here's the look of it, here's the feel of it, here's, just kind of those five senses. Like most organizations won't define what success looks like, or they haven't yet. And I think that's a real loss, because I think the belonging piece is an element to what success would look like. And I think that we can get there. And, in the book, I talk a lot about that in terms of vision setting, and that's more in the how section, more towards the end. But I think that's really, really critical. And that's where I think belonging fits in trying to change workplace cultures. That's a part of what we're striving towards. We can't guarantee that that's going to happen, even when we invest a lot of resources in our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, like right now. Right. But we can work towards it, and we know what that feels like. And we start to establish measurements around understanding how our workers feel right now. And when we start to change things, if that is moving in the direction that we want it to.
How does the importance of belonging relate to the coming out journey?
That's a complicated question. Kind of zooming out from the workplace setting, it's critical. And this is something that we can all, regardless of when we came out, thinking about our family structures, whether it's chosen family or our family of origin, the coming out process, it has everything to do with belonging, because it is one of our most vulnerable times. The coming out process is not static, right? We do it all the time. But the first time, the second time, the 99th time, every time we have that courage to share something about our sexual orientation or our gender identity, we are putting a big part of who we are on the line to either be accepted in that moment or rejected in some way. And we don't have control over the reactions of other people when we share this information about ourselves, but we know immediately if we belong, if we fit in, or if we don't. And, in a family setting, there's enough research around what that can do, especially for younger people. Well, I think this is all around. If it's your family and you came out at 50 or you came out at 17, if your family says, we love you no matter what, this is amazing, that's probably the best case scenario. I would imagine that there's more nuances for most of the listeners, and I can certainly share from my own experience that it was more of a gray area, where it's like, that's not really what I was looking for in this moment. I'm not like physically kicked out of the home, but I certainly feel like we have a lot of work to do to evolve this relationship. And when you bring that into the workplace, especially if when we have had these coming out experiences that have been less than stellar, we're less likely to share that piece of who we are in the workplace. And, there's studies out there. I think the Human Rights Campaign has, the last one that I remember reading from that organization was 2014, and it was more than 50%. 2014, so it's not that long ago, but more than 50% of workers are closeted. They're not out, even in environments where we have non-discrimination protections. We're in a state that has non-discrimination protections on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. People don't want to take that risk, because of job security, and because also, let's be real, it's really difficult to prove discrimination is happening in the workplace. Very, very difficult, even when you do have those great laws and policies in place. So it's understandable. And I think the other piece in the workplace setting with the coming out process and belonging is when we look at senior leadership, the numbers of senior leaders, so people in the C-suite, they've got the fancy titles and, they've ascended in a larger organization, they are even less likely to be out. That number is around 75%. So, the Tim Cooks of the world, Tim Cook is the CEO of Apple. It's very rare to see someone at that level out. And if we don't see it, it's really hard to imagine that we can be it. So to be out in the workplace in a large corporation and not have that be held against us. So we have a long way to go in terms of LGBT inclusion in the workplace, and really, trying to communicate the value of when you are out. When we go back to thinking about the processor of our brain, you free up 20% of your brain worrying about, the things that you can't say about what you did over your weekend or who's in your family or who your partner is. Like, you don't have to worry about that anymore. You can just show up and crunch the numbers and create the budget if that's your job. And you don't have to worry about when people ask you about your weekend, what you did. You can just be straight. Yeah, I hung out with my partner. Our kids came home. we went out to dinner, yay, and move on. But for many of us, it is so hard. It is so hard. And it's understandable. I think if people aren't out in a workplace environment, it's understandable. The culture hasn't shifted. We still have a lot of work to do to change business as usual right now.
I want to take just a moment to thank you for listening to Books and Ideas. Since I'm posting episodes regularly in 2019, I would very much like to reach more listeners. So you can help me in two ways. First, you can subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or whatever your favorite podcast app happens to be. And you can leave a review in iTunes. I know it takes effort to leave a review, so I'm going to show my appreciation by sending out Amazon gift certificates. Just listen to the announcements at the end of this episode to learn how you can qualify. Have you read Michelle Obama's Autobiography yet?
I am listening to it right now on audiobook because I have so many books.
Well, that's how I read it too.
Yes. Yeah. So I got over, she was talking about the Chicago winters. I'm like, oof. Anyway, yeah, I'm not totally done with it.
You may recall that she mentioned that while she was at Princeton, she hung out with this group of Black students, and she explained the reason for that, which was, she talked about the stress of being the minority and how there was this need to have a place where you could really let your hair down, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. There's a book that came out in 2010 called Whistling Vivaldi. And the author, who I'm blanking on his name, he's great, but he was talking about the critical mass. And he was saying he used Justice Sandra Day O'Connor as an example, where when she first got into the courts, I think it was in the 80s, she was the only woman. And similar to Michelle Obama, and for other Black and more broadly people of color at Princeton, right? I think on the Supreme Court, it's even more stark. You're the one, you're the only. And so there's so much pressure that was placed on Sandra Day O'Connor where, she would make a decision and it wasn't just like the substance of the decision. Media wanted to have all these interviews around how her gender, either she didn't have a feminist agenda or she had too much of a feminist agenda that somehow influenced her decision. And she said that at the moment that Ruth Bader Ginsburg came onto the court, all of that went away. That was the critical mass that it took, where it was just like, okay, this is more normal. There's now women on the court. And so she didn't have as much attention, nor did Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the same way that she had when she was the one and only, right? And so I think it's interesting that when you look at bigger institutions, right? So you look at the Princeton example that you just shared with Michelle Obama, it's like there still isn't that critical mass where, she and other Black students should be able to let their hair down regardless of where they are, rather than kind of finding subgroups across the campus to feel a sense of belonging and to have camaraderie and to have people look out for each other. And I think kind of extending it to LGBT workers in the workplace, I do a lot of work here with our Chamber of Commerce in Portland, and we're doing an initiative to expand economic opportunities to trans and non-binary people. We did a listening session last April, and it was really fascinating because there were about 50 or 60 people that were there. And each one of the folks that were there who were employed in larger organizations often shared, I am the one and I am the only, and I feel so far from belonging. So I think that looking more broadly at LGBT communities, there's not enough of us who are out, in a way that can convey that there is a critical mass, although there are exceptions. And I think for younger generations, it might be different. But I think the higher that you send in an organization, the more that you have to lose. And I think maybe that explains some of the behavior for some of these senior executives where they're like, I'm not dealing with this. Like I've worked too hard to get to this place. And so people will assume what they need to assume about me, but I'm not going to show up 100% authentic. So I think there's a lot to what she's saying in that. And I think for many of us in the LGBT community, we can think of one or two examples where it's like we're in this big organization or we're at a community event that's for a general audience. And we see like one or two people that we might assume, which maybe is probably not great, but we have some kind of connection where I'm like, I think that person might be a part of our rainbow family. I'm going to try to seek them out. And immediately you have a trust and rapport and you feel safer in those kind of situations. I know that I do that. And I feel like I'm out all the time. I do this on a podcast and every week. And still, if I'm in an environment where there's a lot of people and I'm not totally sure where I stand, especially if there's another trans person in that audience, I'm definitely going to try to make a friend pretty quickly.
So in Belonging at Work, you also talk about the loneliness epidemic, which is kind of the flip side of belonging. Can you talk a little bit about this? Because I think it's very important.
Yeah, and I think the loneliness epidemic, and it was fascinating to do the research around it, where, I was kind of toying around with this idea where we're in this world where we are so connected. I mean, you're in Alabama right now, I am in Oregon. I mean, like 50 years ago, we couldn't do this in the way that we're doing this now. I mean, it would be a phone call, and I don't know how well the technology would be. My point is that we're hyper connected. I do work. I have some work in South America right now, and it's like, it's amazing. It's amazing that we can be connected. And yet, more so than ever, people are feeling isolated and alone because that connection is not face-to-face human connection. There's, in terms of kind of just the body, how the body responds when people are in the same room together, there's something that is fulfilling about that. There's something that is feeding the soul in a way that sometimes our connection, virtually, that lacks. And I think that speaks to kind of our social media life, right? If people use social media, I have 5,000 friends on Facebook or, whatever that is. No one's picking you up from the hospital. No one's going to be there in those moments where you really need someone. And a study that I read recently was the average person in the United States has 0.8 friends. I don't understand how that works, having not a full percentage point of a friend, but I mean, that says something. And so when I was researching this, I was trying to figure out, what is the role of the workplace? If the average person in this country has 0.8 friends, how can the workplace potentially disrupt that, at least for 8 hours, if you're fortunate enough to be physically in an office building, because so much of our work is now even going virtually, that we're all working from home. But still, you have team connections and team meetings, and you eventually see the people that you work with at some point. And I thought, wow, the workplace does have this potential. And yet I just go back to that, statistic about around 72% of workers feel that they don't have purpose, which has some connection to this sense of belonging. So I do think that the workplace can help disrupt this epidemic. And yet, if we don't do the hard work of trying to define what it means to belong and how we're working towards that to create that culture in the workplace, I don't think we'll get there. But my hope is that this book will kind of light up some people to say, yeah, there's something to this. And let's put our heads together to figure out how we can use our workplace to not only maximize our innovation and our bottom line, but we can actually use the workplace to create healthier communities and individuals. And I think it is picking up, the concept of belonging. I'm seeing it, at least, in kind of the blog post here and there. I'm seeing conferences that are being organized around this concept of safety, trust, and belonging. So I'm feeling hopeful, but I also know that it's going to take a lot of work to get there. And I think the more that we become cognizant and understand that as great as our technology is, it is contributing to a lot of mental health ailments, including the impacts of loneliness. I think that will be a wake-up call for even more people to join this movement and to roll up their sleeves and do the work with us.
So early on, you talked about covering, and I don't remember if you said it or not, but I know in your book you said that more than, I don't remember the percentage of people that cover, but it's not just the people you would think. It can affect everyone. So even if a person's got a strong sense of belonging outside of work, if they're covering or hiding part of who they are, that's stressful and it can take its toll on your health and your work performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the workplace, 75% of people are covering some aspect of who they are. So even at its most basic level, I guess, something that I think a lot of folks might be able to relate to is either themselves or someone that they may know in the workplace. And I use the example of kind of your average guy who is in the financial sector, and he's relatively feeling a sense of belonging both outside and inside the workplace. But he has some concerns because he's thinking about planning a family. And he saw another colleague who was passed up for a promotion because the side conversation that wasn't a part of the official decision making was, he just had a new baby and he's distracted and he won't be able to devote the time needed to make this project successful. So he was passed up. And that created reservations for this particular person in this example because he also didn't want to get passed up. From the outside, right, it wouldn't seem like he would withhold information about his family. He's a part of the dominant work group. He's a white guy, he's straight, he's in a senior position in the workplace. And yet he's still not sharing a critical piece of what most people, are talking about in the workplace because he's still trying to grow in his position and ascend in the organization. So it impacts people that you may, LGBT people, people that are historically underrepresented. And it also impacts people who are a part of those dominant work groups and what is lost from it, what is lost from this aspect of covering. And it's interesting, like just doing generational research and their generalizations. So it's not, not everyone kind of falls into these categories. However, kind of looking at the baby boomer generation where this idea of leadership and kind of fitting into an organization is around assimilating. To be professional is not to talk about the personal, right? And we're seeing this evolution. I just mentioned this earlier, but I think it's important. I think millennials, which are just as large as the baby boomer generation, if not larger, and the following generation, this iGen generation, are really pushing this idea of professionalism and kind of cracking that open to say, I'm not going to assimilate and I'm still going to do an amazing job here. I have the talent. I'm one of the best and brightest. So you can hire me or I can start my own company. I feel like that's kind of where, when we're talking about best and brightest talent, that's a consideration that this kind of older generation really has to, in terms of leadership in the workplace, has to really grapple with. And some of the kind of Fortune 100 companies are taking this very seriously and taking a hard look at how they can change. And I think that is really critical. It's a part of this idea of inclusive leadership is being curious and being open and also being cognizant of your own biases. And I think age going both ways is an unconscious bias that absolutely shows up in the workplace in ways that are both obvious and subtle.
Yeah, you want to talk a little bit more about this idea of unconscious bias since you brought it up?
Yeah. So unconscious biases, they are something, unfortunately, that we all have. And it's understandable. We're programmed from an early age through media, including watching TV, the books we read, things that we learn from our families about ourselves, our cultural identities, our identities in general, and then the identities of groups that are not a part of our in-groups. So these unconscious biases impact everything that we do. And it's just the way that our brain operates in terms of how we organize people, how we organize ideas, how we organize places, things in time that have taken place over our own life. And it's important for us, leaders especially, to be a leader is to be self-aware, is to understand where these unconscious biases live so that we can better manage around them and to really embrace this idea of in an environment, especially in the workplace, where we're working with people across, it's a multicultural, most organizations are multicultural. So the good thing is that, and in the book I talk about this, there are tests like the implicit association test that help us understand where our unconscious biases show up. So that's a test that in the book, I give a link, and it's available through Harvard. If anyone's super interested in this, you can just Google implicit association test. And there are, I think the last time I looked at it, there's at least like 24 different tests that you can understand. One of the ones I encourage people to start with, because I think a lot of people are afraid of learning about themselves and taking this test, is just, start with the age test, because we've been talking about generations in the workplace. And you may be surprised at where your own unconscious biases show up. I would encourage everyone to take as many of those tests as possible, especially if you are interested in this work, because it will make you more effective at serving as a leader, as an ambassador of this message of belonging. The great thing, too, is that many organizations do general trainings around unconscious biases, raising awareness, especially as it relates to making decisions in the workplace. And when you're aware of your unconscious biases at its most base level, if you're a leader, when you come up with a decision-making process for everyday decisions, strategic decisions, whatever it might be, it's really getting a better sense of who do we serve, who's at this table, who is not at this table, and how do we best inform our decisions when we have limited perspectives here. And I think that gets the ball rolling around recognizing that there is a need for a workplace to reflect the communities that are being served, and more broadly, the communities that are kind of located around wherever the operation is located, and to build coalition that way, to make better decisions and to be more conscious of what your intentions are, to make sure that impact aligns with those intentions. Because sometimes, and I talk about this in the book, sometimes when we intend to do something, our impact lands the complete opposite from other people's perspectives around what we thought was a good thing. So I highly, highly recommend the implicit association test.
I would like to talk about something that really stood out for me in the book, and that's the idea of the platinum rule. I'm sure you didn't invent this, but I have to tell you that this was actually the first time I'd ever heard of it. So tell us about the platinum rule.
The platinum rule it goes a step further from the golden rule. So the golden rule is this idea of, we've all learned this in some way or other, treat others in the way in which you want to be treated. And it makes a lot of sense. And it kind of goes to this idea of intentions, right? Where I love bike riding. And so I'm going to treat my best friend to an epic 7-day bike ride across the Rockies. Lots of climbing, really hard. It's going to be awesome, right? That's my intention, is to surprise her, and she's going to love it. And the impact is she doesn't like bike riding. She thinks it's the worst thing in the world. And she's offended that I wasn't able to give her a gift that really honors who she is. Okay, so golden rule doesn't always work, right? Platinum rule is really great because the idea is treat others in the way in which they want to be treated. So you have to kind of extend from your own worldview to get to know another person and to understand how to revere them, not respect them, but how to revere them by getting curious and understanding who they are in the world and what to them makes them feel like they're revered. And I think if we can shift that, one of these kind of basic principles of being a good person in the world, quote unquote, and really moving towards the platinum rule, I think that, even in conversations and kind of in this country where we are today politically, I think that we would see a shift collectively if we could all immediately embrace the platinum rule. I just think it's something that can really guide leaders, at least in particular, in doing this work in a way that will allow them to step up more as inclusive leaders and getting curious about the people that surround them, the people that they lead, and take greater responsibility around that.
Yeah, and I think that connects really well to what you said about intention. Because if your intention is to do something good for another person, and, like your example shows, the golden rule may not accomplish your intention. And I think of the example of pronouns. It seems so easy to say, well, why should that matter? Well, if you're willing to put yourself in the place of the other person, what pronouns they're called may or may not matter. And it's not, would it matter to me what pronoun, but it's, would it matter to you?
Yeah, that's a great example, because intentions and impact are really, really key. And I think, in the work that I've done, especially, when I worked at PFLAG National, we did, and they are still doing, a lot of education around respecting trans and non-binary people. And the pronouns is something that is so basic, right? If someone used a name intentionally or unintentionally, and a pronoun, whether intentionally or unintentionally, consistently, that is wrong from what your name and pronouns are, and that happened day in and day out, I think many people would be like, oh my God, I get it. This is really hard. The last study that I saw, I think about 14% of people either know someone who is trans or work with someone who's trans or non-binary. It's understandable that people don't quite get the importance, the affirmation, the sense of belonging, that when you're using the right name and the right pronoun, you fit in. And unfortunately, people are still struggling with this. And I think where the intention piece comes in is that, And I'll use an example with my family. When I transitioned early in my 20s, I changed my name and I changed my pronouns, and it was very, very hard for them. They knew me for 20 years of my life by a different name. They used a different pronoun. And early on in those years, they messed up a lot. They messed up a lot. And I knew that their intentions were good, but man, that impact sucked for me. And especially, if I was around friends or other people, it just was embarrassing. It was humiliating. It was awful. And they got it. I mean, they knew when they messed up. They're like, oh my God. And then they would make a big deal about apologizing. I'm like, this
that made it worse.
Do better. Yeah, I'm like, just do better the next time. Just apologize and move on. And I see that struggle for a lot of folks, and I get it. I mean, I love my family, they love me, and it's still a struggle. So it was always a blessing for me when I met someone new, because it's like, boom, they got my name, they got my pronoun, it's all good, and we just move on. But it's a little bit harder when you know someone for a long time.
Obviously, I don't read the literature in your field, but I assume that you're taking an unusual approach to the role of diversity and equity and inclusion in the workplace. It seems like you're arguing that it should go beyond just not getting sued. And one of the things I appreciated about your book was that early on you defined several terms, and we have defined several terms during our conversation. But people are constantly throwing around some of these terms carelessly, and I thought we really ought to define diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you. Diversity is, this is common. So people will say this about a dance. So diversity is kind of being invited to go to the dance. Inclusion is being able to make a decision about, I don't know, the music, or your feedback is appreciated to make the party really great. And equity is you're part of the planning committee to make sure that the party is inviting people from all across your community. And I think that the term equity in particular really gets conflated a lot with equality. I mean, equity to me is the larger systemic. We are recognizing that people have different needs, going back to that platinum rule. So we're going to have different responses to different communities within our organization. And unfortunately, people will conflate equity with equality in that people need it's kind of the golden rule, right? People need exactly what I have. And all across the board, this is a uniform distribution of goods, and then we're going to be great. I mean, the reality is that some people will need more and some people will need less. And I think that goes to advantages and disadvantages that people have in the workplace just due to the way that our society is structured. So I think it's really dangerous when people start to kind of use these words synonymously, because I mean, to me, as someone who is a consultant running a business going in to help an organization, if I hear leaders using these words synonymously, that's where I know I need to start. And that's usually where I start, is just kind of doing some really intentional strategic planning with those leaders and doing this kind of like psychoeducation at the same time of clarifying what these terms mean and the power that they have so that they can better assess where they are in that moment in time and where they want to go. And where they want to go, I help them kind of see that they have to be clear on what that organization is that looks successful, that they're not quite there yet. Because if not, this is unfortunately what I've seen with some organizations that start and they go right to the how, is that they start doing programming and they spin their wheels. It's largely a Band-Aid approach. They take tactical approaches, but they're not looking at the system as a whole. They're not looking at the warts in a way that they need to go to the root causes of why the organization is structured the way that it is now and how they would like to restructure it to make some changes that will benefit the people that work there. And of course, looking at the organization's, bottom line. And we know, I mean, the research is there. When you invest in diversity, equity, and inclusion, the last statistic that I saw around this is around $250,000. If you, a big Fortune 100 company, you invest that amount, and for every $250,000 that you invest in, you get $2 million back. And that comes largely through innovation, the teams that have better morale to do that innovation and to do innovative work. And no doubt that increases productivity because people see how this impacts the organization positively and the organization profits from it at its most basic level.
So you have a great cartoon in the book that sort of demonstrates the principle of equity. Do you mind sharing what that cartoon shows?
Yeah, and I would encourage like a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I would definitely encourage your listeners to check this out, and I can send you the link to it. There's an artist who designed this, and I'm blanking on his name. There's the references in the book, so I'll also share that information with your listeners. But essentially, there's two panels, and there's a lot of different iterations of this cartoon. So it's pretty basic, but they're on the left-hand side, it's defining equality. There's a super tall guy to the left. There's a kind of medium tall person in the middle. And then there's a super, super small person to the right. And they all are at a baseball game, and there's a fence in front of them. And they're all given one little crate to stand on, the equal size crate. So inevitably, the super tall person can see over the fence super easily. The one in the middle is just kind of peeking over and can see the game. And the super short person sees nothing. They just see the fence. And so that's defining equality. Everyone has they have the same crate. And when you look to the right, a different cartoon, same game, same fence. The super tall person does not have a crate and can easily see over the fence, is enjoying the game. It's great. The medium-sized person in the middle has one crate and can easily see over the fence. And then the super short person has two crates and is like easily seeing over the fence. So they're all enjoying the game. And that is like taking a really complex concept and just visually showing you equity looks really different than equality. And if you're trying to improve the condition for different workers in a workplace, again, you're going to need to have different responses to help people because they're in different situations. And again, I think that goes back to the platinum rule, where you have to get curious and you have to understand, what is the way that I can revere this person and treat them in the way in which they want to be treated.
And you introduced a really interesting concept in the book, and I actually went to the link for this, the idea of targeted universalism.
Yeah. Targeted universalism talks about, we have universal principles of, we welcome everyone, right? But targeted universalism also recognizes people are going to feel less welcomed into a workplace environment than other people. And so you're going to have different responses for those folks that are less hesitant to engage with you for a variety of reasons. And this is John Powell's work. And so I think he's out of Berkeley. It can be complicated, right? But it's such a simple concept that can help folks who are just starting to get engaged with this work. And it's really, really powerful. And we use a lot of that on the Human Rights Commission here in Portland. And that targeted universalism is our approach. So, what is an issue, a human rights issue that we're going to take up that's going to have the greatest impact to help many, many different people, neighbors that live in Portland? And it's a great guiding principle that I would encourage many leaders, many organizations, folks just listening to this call to get curious about and to learn more about, because if this is work that you're interested in or that you do, I highly recommend checking out John Powell's work.
Yeah, and in your book, you talk about some of the best practices and also things to avoid in people that are working in this area. Is there one single best practice is it the platinum rule?
So it's kind of broken down into chunks, and this is in chapter 8. So if you are a person, you're like, just tell me what I need to do. I still encourage you to do that personal work. But if you want to get started, it's kind of like a scaffolding approach. So of those kind of 5 different kind of best practices, and there's more underneath each of those categories, they build on top of each other. Where I would encourage all of your listeners to go to, if this is something that lights you up, is to start with self-educating. Get more curious about concepts around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. This idea of belonging. Read. If you're listening to this, you like podcasts, right? There's a lot of really amazing podcasts that are out there. One of my mentors, Jennifer Brown, has a podcast called The Will to Change, and that's all she talks about. She talks to people like Kenji Yoshino, who is the scholar who wrote about covering. That's all of his. I think he has a book about covering. So if that's something that was something of interest that we talked about today, go there, because the other best practices get a lot harder. So start by picking up a book or listening to another podcast or talking, if you're in a larger organization, think about connecting with folks that are part of your employee resource groups, if you have those, or if you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer or leader in the organization, learn about what's taking place in your workplace and how you might be able to plug in there.
Is there a single most important pitfall to avoid?
Yes. The single most important pitfall to avoid with self-education is going to an employee who is someone from an underrepresented group in your workplace and asking them to explain. Like, it would be like going up to me to be like, Rhodes, tell me everything about what it means to be trans at work. Like, I'm one person. I'm not a representative of entire communities of people with lots of subcultures within the trans community. So please don't put that onus on the shoulders of another person. I mean, you really have to that's why I say self-education. It's on you to do the hard work of reading, or I think podcasts are great. It's an easy way to learn, but please avoid asking people to explain everything about one aspect of their identity.
And another thing you said that struck me was that if you're choosing a protege or somebody to mentor, don't pick someone that reminds you of yourself.
Yeah. So one of the kind of more challenging best practices they ask people to do or consider is to step up as a mentor for someone who's new to the workplace, maybe a younger professional who's just getting started. And when you're thinking about mentorship, we get attracted to younger people who remind us of our younger self, of like, oh, that young kid, that young trans kid, reminds me of me trying to figure this out, when I was 20, so I'm going to be that person's mentor. Part of mentorship or sponsorship is taking mentorship a step further, in that you're willing to use some of your social capital to advance that person's career in some way. So whatever tactic you take there, it's a two-way street. You're not just imparting your wisdom, you're also learning about the next generation's views on professionalism or what it means to bring their whole selves to work. It's such a valuable volunteer aspect of your everyday work on the job. So the idea is to build cross-cultural relationships within the workplace. So seek out younger talent or seek out talent that's new to the workplace who is from a different identity group than you. That's where the greatest learning will come, so long as you're curious about that person, right? I mean, there's a distinction of being curious about me as Rhodes Perry versus asking me to explain everything about what it means to be trans. And I think if you can master that, kind of the mentorship piece also can help you really learn and build empathy with folks who have completely different lived experiences than your own.
So what else would you like to share before we close?
Well, Ginger, thank you for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. I would love for people to check out the book, or at least the website where you can find it. And that's at belongatwork.com, or you can find it at rhodesonamazon.com. And the cool thing that I'm doing right now in February this year, 2019, and also later, I'll be offering a 30-day belonging challenge. And it's largely virtual, where you get a very short email every day that talks about some concept of the book. And it gives you a very simple action. So the idea is it's not going to take more than 5 minutes every day to really practice with some of the concepts that are featured in the book. There's 2 different coaching calls in that month that the program is being offered. What I'm making available to folks that are interested in this is that if you get a copy of the book and you like it or you read it and you want to leave a review, if you leave a review in Amazon, you're eligible to get 50% off of the 30-day belonging challenge. And I think it's going to be great. We did something similar last year and it was amazing. It was amazing to have so many people from really different workplaces. Like we had someone from the UN, we had someone from Wells Fargo, we had a lot of people from smaller nonprofits and government agencies. So really different sectors. And yet we were able to really connect around some of these core concepts and kind of apply them to different settings. And they were doing this real time. So it was great to see the results and what they learned at the end of that program. So I definitely encourage people, if you like this topic, consider that, and just consider me and my website, rhodesperry.com. There's a blog there that offers tons of free content. Consider that a resource if this is a topic of interest.
And I will say your podcast, The Out Entrepreneur, you don't have to be out or an entrepreneur to enjoy it, because you get such interesting, great guests.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. And that is, that's at outentrepreneur.com. cultivate.com. And I love it. I learned so much from the people who are on the show. And yeah, thank you. Thank you for promoting the show. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. So thanks again, Rhodes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I want to thank Rhodes Perry for coming on Books and Ideas to share his book, Belonging at Work. A key idea I want to leave you with is that the feeling of belonging is important to everyone. As I've mentioned many times on my Brain Science podcast, we are wired to be social. And as Rhodes reminded us, our brain processes social rejection in a way very similar to the way it processes pain. The flip side of this is that we're actually in the midst of a loneliness epidemic because virtual online friends can't take the place of real face-to-face human interaction. Unless you're retired, work probably consumes the majority of your time. So it's worthwhile to ask whether your work is feeding or starving your need for belonging. You don't have to belong to a minority to suffer from the stress that comes from holding back your authentic self at work. This term may be new to you, but it's called covering, and as Rhodes pointed out, more than 70% of people do it at some point. Covering is a source of stress and also decreases productivity. Cultivating a feeling of belonging at work is not only the right thing to do, but it's a smart business strategy. It's a win-win strategy. But in his book, Rhodes also acknowledges the reality of resistors. I want you to remember that there is solid research showing that the feeling that you belong at work is good for the individual and good for the organizations they work for. Feeling of belonging is also closely related to feeling one's job has purpose. Another key idea is that we all have unconscious biases, and the best way to deal with them is by learning what they are. I'm going to have a link in the show notes to the implicit association tests from Harvard, as well as a link to information about targeted universalism, because I think that's another very worthwhile concept. Last but not least, I agree with Rhodes that it's time to move past the golden rule to the platinum rule, which means trying to treat others as they want to be treated. This amazingly simple concept could reduce conflict in so many aspects of our lives. I would love to hear what you think about this episode, so you can email me at docartemis@gmail.com. And don't forget, there is actually a Books and Ideas fan page on Facebook, and the show notes are at booksandideas.com. As I mentioned earlier, this year I would really like to reach more listeners, so I need your help. Please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you happen to listen to your podcasts. I really need new reviews in iTunes. So I'm going to be doing Amazon gift certificates. And the way that it's going to work is the first person who sends me a screenshot every month will get a $25 gift certificate. Everyone else who sends me a screenshot will go into a drawing for a monthly $15 gift certificate. But if you don't win, you'll still stay in the hat and you'll be eligible for future drawings. So my overall schedule for podcasting for 2019 will be hopefully something like the following. Brain Science is going to continue coming out on the 4th Friday of the month. I'm going to be aiming for the 15th of the month for Books and Ideas. And my new podcast, Grain Rainbows, is coming out every Monday. So I hope that you will check all these shows out, and I look forward to talking with you again very soon. Books and Ideas is copyright 2019 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You can copy this podcast to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at docartemis@gmail.com. Theme music for Books and Ideas is The Open Door by Beatnik Turtle. Please visit their website at beatnikturtle.com.